to Law Minds YouTube channel. Today we will learn about some doctrines and their significance under Indian Constitution. Now, what are doctrines? Doctrines is basically a guideline, procedural step, tenet of the law or a test that helps determine a judgment of case. Doctrines are developed by the judiciary while taking a stance for the case or while interpreting the cases. Indian Constitution has adopted various doctrines due to the need of the hour for helping the judiciary for giving a logical or reasonable interpretation of law. Doctrine simply means a step or a test that helps the judiciary to take righteous steps during the trial of a case and to deliver a proper judgment with the interpretation of law. Now let's look forward to the types of doctrines. Doctrines of basic structure, doctrines of severability, doctrines of eclipse, doctrine of waiver, doctrine of pitch and substance, doctrine of colorable legislation, doctrine of lashes, doctrine of judicial review, doctrine of territorial nexus, and doctrine of separation of powers. These were the types of doctrines in the Indian Constitution. Now let's focus on some important doctrines among these. First is doctrine of basic structure. The doctrine of basic structure was introduced to ensure that no misuse of amendment of power was going on by the legislature. As the legislature has the power to amend anything in the constitution as per the requirement, but it can be observed that there was a lot of unethical use of these power by the legislation. The legislation used this power of amendment to amend the constitution as per their need. This doctrine was prescribed by the Supreme Court in several cases. The starting of this doctrine is Golaknath versus State of Punjab. In this case, the Supreme Court observed that the legislation has made certain amendments which are subject to amend the Part 3 of the Indian Constitution, that is the fundamental rights. As the fundamental of part of constitution is out of the purview of the legislation, the Supreme Court made some provisions which did not allow the legislation to amend constitution as easily as they used to do. Now the first step in the evaluation of doctrine of basic structure, there were some restrictions put on by the Supreme Court towards the use of the amendment power. Next is 24th Constitutional Amendment. Because of the Golaknath case, the power of the amendment of the legislation was devoid. The legislation to review the previous power as it is, the 24th Amendment was made and the lost power on the amendments were restored. Now that the Supreme Court has put on some restrictions on the legislation on the use of the amendments, here the legislation by putting forward 24th Constitutional Amendment tried to restore their lost power on the usage of amendment, and they succeeded in doing that. Next is the Kesavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala case. In this case, the Supreme Court overruled the decision in the Golaknath case and also outlining the doctrine of basic structure. Even though it wasn't prescribed as to what constitutes basic structure, but the judges described the element which can constitute basic structure. Now here in Kesavananda Bharati case, judges gave out some points to highlight what can constitute to be a basic structure. As per A. Sikri, Chief Justice, the supremacy of the Constitution, republican and democratic forms of government, secular character of the Constitution, separation of powers between the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, federal character of the Constitution were some points laid to constitute the basic structure by Chief Justice A. Sikri. Now, according to Justice Shailath and Justice Grover, the supremacy of the Constitution, republican and democratic forms of government, secular character of the Constitution, separation of powers between the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, and the federal character of the Constitution, similar to Chief Justice A. Sikri's points, these justices also seemed to put forward these points as the points to constitute basic structure. In the case of Justice Jagan Mohan Reddy, it was the preamble which lays down the basic structure. It was said by Jagan Mohan Reddy Justice, and the Points which can constitute the basic structure was similar to Chief Justice A. Sikri, Justice Shailat and Justice Grover. Now let's go forward to doctrine of severability. This doctrine is also known as doctrine of separability. As the name itself indicates, it is basically a process of severing or separating. Simply, this doctrine separates the provisions from the statute. When a single provision of the whole statute contradicts or violates the Constitution of India, it can be separated from the statute and the statute will process as it used to. If any provision is not dependent on any other provision of the statute and that particular provision is in the contradiction of the Constitution, it can be severed from the rest of the statute under this doctrine. Simply, it means if one provision in the statute contradicts the Constitution, only that single provision can be severed, leaving the statute untouched. But it can only happen if the provision wasn't dependent on the rest of the statute. Now, the cases of doctrine of severability is A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras. In this case, the Supreme Court declared Section 14 of the Preventive Detention Act 1950 as ultra-virus, and the omission of this section won't make any difference in the legislation of the Act, and hence the judgment of declaring Section 14 ultra-virus did not affect the whole provisions. Next doctrine is doctrine of eclipse. This doctrine comes from Article 13 of the Indian Constitution. It does not apply to the post-constitutional law. As the name itself indicates, this doctrine is an eclipse on the provision which infringes the fundamental rights of the Constitution by the fundamental rights. It simply means that any provision which infringes the Constitution will not be dead or invalid, rather it will be covered or overshadowed by the fundamental rights, and the contradictory provision will be in the morbid state. The case of this doctrine is Bikaji Narayan versus State of Madhya Pradesh. In this case, it was observed by the court that the doctrine of eclipse is based on the concept that if a law is violative of the Constitution, it does not get nullified or removed from the statute, rather it remains unenforceable. It is overshadowed by the fundamental rights and it remains in a dormant state and is not dead. Next doctrine is doctrine of territorial nexus. This doctrine is based on the implication of the law on the objects. According to this doctrine, the law can be implied to any object even if it is not located in state. It is enough if the object has a connection with the territory. This doctrine was discussed in the Article 245 of the Indian Constitution. Subject to the provision of this Constitution, Parliament may make laws for the whole or any part of the territory of India, and the legislature of a state may make laws for the whole or any part of the state. No law made by Parliament shall be deemed to be invalid on the ground that it would have extraterritorial operations. These were the most important doctrines under the Indian Constitution which helps the judiciary to make the decisions. I hope everybody understood what are doctrines under the Indian Constitution, and I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much.